Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 39 of Truth is Justice. We're interested in looking closer at the case, but first, I'm not sure whether you've had a chance to listen to any of our podcast episodes, but we take a very different approach to that demonstrated by many of the wrongful conviction podcasts. We do not take a one-sided approach to presenting a case. We are essentially neutral and let the case material guide our approach to the case. We have some highly qualified people as part of our audience from a range of different fields. IT experts, blood pattern analysts, crime scene investigators, medical personnel, etc. And perhaps more importantly, a group of people who are tenacious in reading through every word of every document and performing some truly exceptional outside research. As a result, if there is something to be found in the material, or even something remote to the case that hasn't yet been uncovered, chances are someone in our group will find it. As an example, in the case we are currently covering, the murder of Mr. Jaime Melgar, our audience has uncovered evidence from within the case material that has now made its way into the state's appeal reply brief documents. Pieces of evidence that were missed by both the state and the defence at trial, evidence that is truly damning for the defence and demonstrates what a double-edged sword the publicity of a case can be. I raise all this because if we cover the case, I can assure you that we will be thorough and not shy away from the evidence because of intimidation or influence by parties connected to the case. In many ways, that is what makes our approach so powerful. We will not take the same approach as culpable. We will make up our own minds. Let me know your thoughts. Now that was a message I sent to someone a couple of months ago. I'll give the full context towards the end of this episode, but I think it sums up our approach to the Melgar case and to our approach to material and evidence in general. We have no vested interest in a particular outcome when we look at a piece of evidence or when we look at a case as a whole. To be clear, and we've addressed this many times before, but we have a lot of new listeners, so it's worth repeating, we literally have no interest in the outcome, financial or otherwise. We are not paid to do this. We do not receive ad revenue or sponsor money or Patreon donations, nothing. We spend our money and considerable amounts of our time to do this. We don't even overly commit to a particular position. So it isn't even a hit to our egos if positions we have arrived at based on an analysis of the evidence are shown to be in some way or completely wrong. For example, if the computer logins on Sandra's laptop happen to be the work of a group of international spies who tortured Jaime for Sandra's password on one laptop in a desperate attempt to access that data, but notably not the data on any of the other computers and IT devices throughout the house, and then they forgot to actually take that all-important laptop with them, if that is proven to be what happened, well, so be it. It wouldn't bother me in the slightest that my determination that the laptop login was initiated by Sandra and entirely contradicts her narrative was wrong under those circumstances. But having said that, crucially, it isn't reasonable to assume that it was as likely to be the group of international spies logging in as it was Sandra on the basis that the investigators didn't look into the possibility that it was a group of international spies. You could make the argument that detectives Carazol and Doucet didn't reach out to foreign intelligence agencies for information on Jaime's murder, or you could take the position that such a step would be pointless and a waste of resources. Now, whilst that's an extreme example, it is applicable to other scenarios. situations where, just because a given scenario wasn't investigated to the nth degree by the investigators, does not mean that it is more likely to have occurred than the conclusion that the investigators ended up making. Personally, it does not impact on my life in any way, whether scenario A, scenario B, or any other scenario for that matter, is the actual truth. That is not to be disrespectful to the families of victims or those hounded by keyboard warriors in search of what they believe to be justice. I know, for those people, the ongoing distress in their lives is substantial. But I believe that it is a highly relevant point that I personally am not impacted by which way the evidence leads us, and neither are any of our team that work on Truth is Justice unduly influenced by the outcomes. What is of utmost importance to me, and the whole premise of Truth is Justice, is that conclusions reached have to have a basis in rational and factual support, and that is the best way to actually get to the truth. Now stop and think about that for a minute, because it's highly relevant to the Melgar case, and I believe it will be highly relevant to our next case. There is almost no way to definitively prove that something happened a particular way in a criminal context, or really any context for that matter, if you apply lateral enough thinking. There is always an angle to challenge the quality of the investigation that was undertaken, entirely regardless of how thorough that investigation was. So, an investigation where 50 DNA swabs were taken, but each of them came back with a result you don't agree with, and results that don't support your position, well, no problem at all. You can argue against it in many different ways. You can claim the swabs were deliberately taken in locations where the investigators knew what they were going to find. And don't laugh, that's actually the situation claimed by some people in the Melgar case. Or you can claim that the lab that processed the results contaminated the samples. Or even more compelling, they did so as part of a bigger cover-up to support the investigators because the lab often works directly with the DA. If all else fails, you can simply claim that 50 samples was not enough. 500 DNA samples should have been taken. And that if those results still don't match your expectations, you can attach some type of fictional confirmation that those results prove that a cleanup of DNA took place. Even video footage, appearing to clearly show an event, is susceptible to manipulation, and claims along those lines could be made by those disputing the determination. In my opinion, the best way to get to the truth is to assess whether the scenario offered up is likely, even remotely likely. If it takes tens or hundreds of different, highly unlikely events to happen all at once, as is the situation with the Melgar case, then chances are it didn't happen that way. The truth may not be easy to hear and to accept, and sometimes it can even be difficult to comprehend. A wife violently murdering her husband of more than 3 decades, for example. But nevertheless, it is still the truth. So, the international spies torturing Jaime for the password, if that seemed to remotely fit with the evidence, great. We would have flagged it as a possibility and gone down the path of pursuing that as a plausible scenario. But it didn't fit with the evidence, not even remotely. Neither does the evidence fit that the same torture would have been conducted by a mafia group from Florida or a ragtag bunch of intruders with an extreme level of parkour and gymnastic skills, allowing them to exit a garage over bags of leaves whilst carrying heavy power tools without disturbing the bags of leaves. Of course, there are also the almost comical claims that Jaime was murdered by a vagrant living in the roof cavity of the Melgar family home, and this person snuck down in the middle of their anniversary jacuzzi soak to murder Jaime and then went back into hiding in the ceiling cavity, therefore avoiding capture. Now, can that scenario be absolutely, definitively ruled out? No, of course not. No matter how in-depth the investigation was, you couldn't say with 100% certainty that that vagrant, or a group of international spies, or a mafia mob from Florida didn't kill Jaime Melgar. That claim, and the mafia claim, and all the other claims, appeased many of Bob's most vocal supporters, and they felt that it added further fuel to the fire of claims that the investigation was botched. Even when it was shown that the ceiling cavity was indeed checked as part of the investigation. I mean, talk about thorough investigative work. Still, even after the investigation reached that level, some people thought the vagrant story remained a possibility, and questioned whether fingerprints were lifted and DNA testing was undertaken throughout the ceiling cavity to prove that a vagrant wasn't present. If it was, it would not have made a difference. Now go back to my scenario above. It would be claimed that either the swabs and fingerprint dusting were performed in the wrong spots, or, in the end, the vagrant cleaned up the scene. The broader point is this. If conclusive evidence comes forward that shows one of the 1% events happened, or 10 unique 1% events, all happened at the same time, we will not just accept that, we will shout it from the rooftops. And by 1% events, I mean those events that are so unlikely to have happened, they might have happened 1 out of 100 times, but there still remains a small possibility that they did happen. So following that line of thought, the odds that a vagrant was going to murder Jaime Melgar, already a highly unlikely event, but that the vagrant was then interrupted by a group of international spies, an equally highly unlikely event, is exceedingly, massively unlikely. Even without an investigation, specifically addressing each of those elements, you know the outcome is going to be extremely unlikely. And that will be a point that we will carry through. Keep an open mind, and of course, be prepared for surprises, but also realise that the world is mostly a largely rational and reasonably predictable place, and matters need to be presented fairly. So here we are, at our 39th episode, something I'm pretty surprised about. I was always determined to present as much material on the Melgar case as possible, but I definitely wouldn't have imagined a situation where we would reach 39 episodes, where we would be embarking on coverage of a new matter, and be actually making a difference when it comes to finding the truth. Thank you all for your patience on the release of this episode. Following discussion on various points carrying on from the Melgar case, we will be introducing the new matter that we will be covering. Where truth is justice, and we are setting the record straight. Jaime's life insurance policy was glossed over by Bob and Liz several times during his coverage of the case. They were both consistently unclear on the amount of life insurance that Jaime had, even when questions were asked directly about the amount. The amounts they quoted ranged from a couple of $100,000 to $500,000. I remember thinking at the time that was very odd. Bob prides himself on his attention to detail. He went to the end of the earth, remember, over a Costco shirt. Yet, he never seemed interested in clarifying the specific circumstances surrounding Jaime's life insurance. Did he know the specific circumstances and simply didn't want to raise something uncomfortable for Liz and Sandra? I don't know. But we do know that Liz, at least at some point in time, had a very good knowledge of Jaime's life insurance, and even confirmed that at Sandra's trial. Liz confirming that she took care of the administrative process of claiming Jaime's various life insurance policies. Yet, when asked about it in the Facebook pages of Bob's show last year, less than a year after remembering it at trial, she claimed to know very little about it. Further, she offered up comments that seemed to muddy the waters on the life insurance. Typical of her commentary on the case, I suppose, but claiming that the various life insurance policies were complicated. And that was it. The discussion finished as far as Bob was concerned. But not us. There may be some reasons why Bob and Liz didn't want to clarify the details. Perhaps Liz's lupus fog impaired her memory during those periods of time when she was asked about it, or perhaps there was something that didn't reflect well on Sandra. Many of you would be aware of the fact that the first claim on Jaime's multiple life insurance policies came just a few weeks after his death. An incident report entry of Tuesday, 15th of January 2013 details how the insurance company contacted Detective Carousel on that date, most likely indicating that Liz or Sandra actually filed the claim as many as a few days prior. Now, there are some interesting elements of the life insurance policy to consider. How well known was the discussion of Jaime's life insurance policy claim amongst friends of the Melgars? I say that because if you review comments on various forums, you'll notice that the, in my view, speedy claim on Jaime's life insurance policy was known amongst some people outside of the family. Also, Liz's malpractice suit was finalised just 2 months prior to Jaime's murder, with the outcome, I believe, being that Liz was unsuccessful in her claim. Imagine the financial cost of launching and then fighting a protracted legal battle for such a claim. And Liz was legally represented throughout, so it cannot be argued that the legal fees were avoided somehow through self-representation. Liz has also claimed that medical debts totalling $80,000, debts associated with the treatment that she would suggest was the basis for her malpractice suit. Now, here's the really interesting part, and a big thank you to a friend for gathering this material and raising the questions. We do not actually know whether the $100,000 policy, which doubled to $200,000, whether that policy was ever paid out. I'd always personally assumed that it hadn't been, mostly based on comments from Liz, but we actually do not have any evidence to confirm whether it was or wasn't. Yes, the insurance company contacted police, but there's not any written confirmation that we have beyond that. But there's some reasonably good information to suggest that the life insurance policy, being the $100,000 one doubling to $200,000, was possibly paid out. About a week later, on the 23rd of January 2013, Sandra closed on the house in College Station for approximately $145,000 in cash. Now, Liz's stories about where they got the money to purchase the house are all over the place. From scraping together money she had in her own personal accounts to money from her grandmother. To not know the source of funds for a cash house purchase, and yes, this question was asked of Liz multiple times via Bob's Show's Facebook page, and her responses were consistently vague. Now that to me seems particularly strange. Ask yourself whether you would know where the funds came from for a house purchase in cash. I believe that most people would. And note that Sandra and Liz left on their European holiday for a month or so immediately after closing on the sale of the College Station house. And remember that Liz moved there with her husband, who had just taken up his position at a new job. So we have a situation of a new house, a new job, and then Liz and Sandra leaving for Europe for a month. I do believe that Liz stated that her and her husband had already packed up all of their things and shipped them to the Melgar's home at Kelsey Meadows Court as of November 2012 in preparation for their move. So what was the real purpose of the European holiday so shortly after Jaime's death? One can speculate. Then several months after returning from the European holiday, the larger policy claim was lodged. That policy was for $466,000 with an additional $20,000. Again, the assumption is that that policy was never paid, but do we know that for sure? Knowing that there are those outstanding questions about the insurance policies, at least for me, raises the thought of why that matter was handled so strangely by Liz whenever the topic came up. Now, some of you will recall how Jaime was claimed to be meticulous with financials, and how his attention to financial details allowed him to plan on retiring early. That may not be the full explanation of the situation, though. Listen to this audio clip. It's an extract of the interview conducted with Mr. Carlos Espinoza, a work colleague of Jaime's.
And the last time you, I guess, got an email from him is when?
Well, I gotta search for him. This is an email that I just got from the long time ago, back in summer, when he was noticed that he was supposed to be rehired. You know what happened to him was some time ago, 1 year, we have a reorganization in the district, and the manager that we had back then, he made him resign. He has to leave.
Oh, okay.
And then after...
What year was that?
Last year, I would say around April, March. I would say March. Yeah, March 2012. So now,
2012?
2012. Now that you say, now I remember because of this, that he kind of wasn't a really good friend. He was probably the only person that he was reluctant to, the previous project manager that we had before, which basically fired him.
Okay.
Yeah.
For what reason do they know? Do you know?
Well, the reason is because budget cuts and reorganization in the district. So.
Did he get along with the guy? Did the guy not like him, or? Well,
we always talk about him like, he did this, he didn't do this, like criticism.
The boss did.
His
okay.
project manager, I would say.
The ex-project
manager.
And who is that?
Not project manager. He's ex-supervisor, I should say.
Okay, and who is that?
And notice the language that Carlos uses in describing how Jaime left his place of employment. He states that Jaime was fired by his supervisor when he was 3 months short of his retirement. Again, focusing on Bob's attention to detail, it's peculiar to me that that description was not followed up on. You can bet if Mr. Malbrough was fired from a job around the time of Jaime's death, Bob would have used that to justify his involvement in Jaime's murder. Yet, we have an event, being Jaime's sacking, and that event is not mentioned at all. What does that mean? I don't know, possibly nothing, but it shows that with a bit of digging and close attention paid to every bit of the material, something more can be uncovered, and you can get a bit more insight into the dynamics of the family. What were the circumstances surrounding Jaime's sacking? Was it purely budget related? Would that be done when someone was 3 months short of retirement? Maybe. What would have been the dynamics within the marriage following Jaime's sacking and before his rehiring? It would presumably have been a very stressful period for Jaime, a man who, by all accounts, was frugal and planned things carefully. Would that have caused issues within the marriage, with Sandra's claims of a retirement filled with holidaying road trips and a beach house? Now, these are all avenues of analysis that were entirely ignored by Bob throughout his coverage of the Malbrough case. He had Liz on the show and could have asked her these and many more questions to allow the listeners to get answers and to develop a better overall picture of the case. Instead, the push for Sandra's acquittal, the Free Sandy show, continued unabated, and far from being unbiased, it completely avoided the difficult questions. And it is the difficult questions that allow you to get the answers. And there's so much more to the case of the murder of Mr. Jaime Melgar. So many angles of analysis that, with time and passion for inquiry, answers could be obtained. It doesn't always make for great entertainment, but it does provide answers. And we're not finished with our coverage of the Melgar case. There are several other elements that I feel are important to discuss. Elements that have been investigated by people that deserve to be aired. And they will be aired. And my intention is this: to finish the main component of our coverage of the Melgar case on the 19th of January. As many of you know, Sandra's appeal is currently being considered, and the claimed exculpatory DNA evidence, which was promised many, many months ago, still apparently looms large, but bizarrely, it's kept very secret. Depending on how that appeal progresses, and whether any DNA results are eventually released, we will come back to the case as is necessary. For now, though, it's time to introduce the next matter we will cover: the death of Mr. Christian Andriacchio. 21-year-old Christian Andriacchio of Meridian, Mississippi, was found on February 26, 2014, slumped over a bathtub with a gunshot wound to the head. The on-site investigation being undertaken at the apartment where Christian was found concluded after a short period of time, and the final conclusion made that Christian's death was suicide. As you will see when we begin our coverage of this case, whether Christian's death was a suicide, as was initially determined, or murder, is where the controversy and the answers lie. Of course, I could provide you with multiple, lengthy, detailed narratives leading up to and following Christian's death, including the circumstances surrounding the immediate investigation, but as you know, each variation of the narrative will have significant elements of speculation central to it, and will be disputed to varying degrees, depending on who is considering it. There are no predetermined, biased, dramatic, and emotional narratives here designed to lead you in a particular direction. Just the facts. And from that starting point, we will look at this matter in a different way to everyone else. We will pore over details that others haven't, and we will keep an open mind to possibilities that others have long ago dismissed. In approaching this matter in that way, we will get closer to the truth than others. Many of you have probably guessed the origins of that text that I read at the beginning of this episode. It was sent by me via messenger to a profile of a gentleman named Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner contacted us a few months ago, bringing the Andriacchio matter to our attention. We're in the process of preparing to start looking into a new case, so in that respect, it was good timing. I'll clear up some rumours here around his involvement with Truth is Justice, because it seems some people and some groups have arrived at the position that we are all somehow being influenced by Mr. Wagner in some way. Those that know what Truth is Justice is all about and what got us started know just how ridiculous those rumours are. And this will come as quite a surprise to some of you, but I haven't spoken to Mr. Wagner. Not once. We have planned to, but it just hasn't happened. We've shared messages via Messenger, but that's all. So, if you're one of those people that believe our coverage of this matter is being carefully managed by Mr. Wagner, you're entirely wrong. Assumptions made about Mr. Wagner's influence over what we do here at Truth is Justice need to consider the wording of that original message, and I'll read it out again. Now remember, this was sent to Mr. Wagner early on, maybe within the first dozen messages sent back and forth, and importantly, only when we had already decided, as a group here at Truth is Justice, that we were likely going to look at this matter anyway, irrespective of how Mr. Wagner replied. So here's the message again, and listen to it carefully. We are interested in looking closer at the case, but first, I'm not sure whether you have had a chance to listen to any of our podcast episodes, but we take a very different approach to that demonstrated by many of the wrongful conviction podcasts. We do not take a one-sided approach to presenting a case. We are essentially neutral and let the case material guide our approach to the case. We have some highly qualified people as part of our audience from a range of different fields. IT experts, blood pattern analysts, crime scene investigators, medical professionals, etc. And perhaps more importantly, a group of people who are tenacious in reading through every word of every document and performing some truly exceptional outside research. As a result, if there is something to be found in the material, or even something remote to the case that hasn't yet been uncovered, chances are someone in our group will find it. As an example, in the case we are currently covering, the murder of Mr. Jaime Melgar, our audience has uncovered evidence from within the case material that has now made its way into the state's appeal reply brief documents. Pieces of evidence that were missed by both the state and the defence at trial, evidence that is truly damning for the defence and demonstrates what a double-edged sword the publicity of a case can be. I raise all this because if we cover the case, I can assure you that we will be thorough and not shy away from the evidence because of intimidation or influence by parties connected to the case. In many ways, that is what makes our approach so powerful. We will not take the same approach as culpable. We will make up our own minds. Let me know your thoughts. Mr. Wagner's response to that, being to remain positively engaged with me in supporting our coverage of the case, speaks absolute volumes about his confidence in his position on this matter and his willingness for anyone and everyone, including various experts, to look at this whole thing closely. Now, Mr. Wagner's passion for this case is incredible, and his knowledge of the material is, in a word, excellent. He has, clearly to me, arrived at his views of the case based on a thorough understanding of the material, the evidence, not from listening to a one-sided podcast. Those that know the various people involved will know Mr. Wagner's connection to the matter, and some could argue that he approaches it with a particular level of bias. And that's fair enough. It would certainly be reasonable to assume that, but you cannot question his depth of knowledge of the material. Now, one staggering aspect of this matter for me, and one of the things that is most intriguing, has been the different approaches taken to the evidence in this matter. The reason I say staggering is because I would have expected the opposite. I think the opposite of what we see is what you would usually expect. I'll explain what I mean. What I've observed from the two distinct groups, and for ease of description, a group who believe Christian's death was murder and another group that believe his death was from suicide, what I've observed is that the group who are pushing hard for the release and consideration of all material and the close examination of every aspect of this case are not those who believe it was murder. The push for transparency is coming from those who believe Christian's death was suicide, as was determined. Importantly, and tellingly, in my opinion, that is also the group, in this instance talking about those directly accused of murdering Christian and their families, who you would imagine would be the most concerned about something appearing in the material and therefore not wanting it to be released. So what we do see, again tellingly for me, is those who believe Christian's death was as a result of homicide going to significant lengths to prevent open discussion of the case material and taking legal action against those who dare distribute it. Within 12 or so hours of announcing our intention to cover this case, we received the first veiled legal threat from a member of the Andriacchio family. Wrap your head around that. Within 12 hours, and just from a neutral Facebook post that definitely didn't give any indications of which way we would cover the case, The subsequent threats have been less veiled, but all focus on the same thing. All seem to centre around this core belief by those who believe Christian was murdered, that the way to get justice for Christian is to dispute the conclusions made in the reports, dispute the authenticity of the case material being distributed, and use that to support claims that Christian's death is some form of cover-up. Now, that brings me to an important question. Where did we get the case materials? Surprisingly, this has been a matter of significant importance for many people, mostly those who would fall into the Christian was murdered group. The topic has been so important that I'm aware of some discussions on the Justice for Christian page with some truly bizarre conclusions about where and how we received the material. It seems to all come back to the intriguing and entirely difficult to understand position taken by those who believe Christian was murdered that no one should have access to the case material. Now, it's no secret that Mr. Wagner has access to the case file, nor does it need to be. He lodged a FOIA request, along with other individuals, and received a copy of the case materials. He kindly let us know that he had the case materials and was happy to provide the documents he obtained to allow us to conduct some independent review. At the same time, a few Google searches showed several discussions taking place on Reddit about this matter, where it appeared that individuals had had access to the case materials. Contacting several of those people and explaining my interest in the case allowed me to gain access to the case materials via several other sources. And comparing those with material that Mr. Wagner had obtained went a considerable way to confirming to me that the material was more or less complete and unaltered. When we began publishing the case material on our website, the comments started appearing, stating that the source of the material we used was biased, therefore the material itself couldn't be trusted. And presumably, the authors of those comments were referring to an assumed involvement by Mr. Wagner. The reality is, the case materials are already very widely disseminated amongst various interested groups, and from what I can tell, despite the various claims of versions missing material, all the holdings are the same. To test that, and to make sure that we had the most complete version, I've put up a post on the Facebook page requesting anyone with additional case material or information on how the case material we have so far published is supposedly altered to contact us. We have received a grand total of one message addressing that. And that message was from a member of our Facebook group about an hour after our publishing of the Knox & Associates report. Now that report, which is actually presented as a presentation rather than a paper, was privately commissioned and is included as an attachment to another privately commissioned report, the Arden Report. And we'll go into the details of those reports at a later date, but for now, I wanted to highlight how the Arden Report attachment of the Knox & Associates report contains an additional 2 pages, being a page with a heading and a page with a single photograph and a paragraph of text that are not included in the Knox & Associates standalone presentation. The member highlighted that for us and asked me whether those pages had been intentionally removed by us. Now, of course, they hadn't been removed by us, but that claim made me interested in understanding why the standalone Knox & Associates presentation did not include those 2 luminol pages. The write-up is there for everyone to see in the Arden Report, so it would seem ludicrous to believe it was specifically excluded to prevent people seeing the luminol results. Yet, that is exactly what those who believe Christian was murdered claim. They claim that those luminol pages prove, yes, that's right, that they definitively prove that Christian was murdered, yet no one seems willing to actually provide a colour copy of the luminol photo, or even a version of the Knox & Associates report presentation that includes those 2 pages. I put up a separate post regarding these claimed 2 redacted luminol pages, asking for anyone with information on it to contact us, on the basis of simply wanting to present the full picture. We received no response to that. But there was an interesting reference made to our comments in the Justice for Christian group. The comments suggested that we were scrambling to get hold of material and seemed to mock our attempts to present a complete, unbiased picture of the case. Now, I'll go into detail on some of these claims when our first proper episode of the Christian Andriacchio matter starts, but for now, ask yourself this. If 2 pages, 1 photo and a heading and a paragraph of text, represented conclusive evidence of Christian's murder, why would anyone, let alone the family of Christian, choose to withhold that material from the public, whilst at the same time claiming an intent to solve the claimed mystery surrounding his death. We have the paragraph of text, we have the heading, we have a black and white photo, but for some reason access to that colour luminol photograph seems to be extraordinarily and bizarrely elusive. I'll put out the request again. If you have access to this supposedly entirely conclusive photograph, please contact us. Alternatively, if you know a valid reason why material that is supposedly so damning would be valuable in obtaining justice for Christian whilst being kept from everyone, please let me know. I've thought about it at length and cannot think of a reason. Now, did we obtain the case materials via a FOIA request? No, we didn't. That question's been asked probably a dozen times on our Facebook group page. Could we? Yes, of course. If I thought there was the ability to gain access to material that isn't already widely available, I would have lodged that request. But the reality is, the material is widely available, and not just via Mr. Wagner. Head over to Reddit and contact some of the users, and you can have a complete version of the case material in your possession in a short period of time. Is the version we have complete? Yes, I have every reason to believe that it is. But more on that in a minute. It's always interesting looking at how theories evolve to try and support, sometimes desperately, a particular position, especially when, in many instances, those theories contradict other vital elements of the narrative, therefore often collapsing the whole position. With the forensics, being the forensics of different types, the forensics of this matter are obviously very important, and accordingly, we'll be looking at them in detail. And when thinking about those forensic matters, it might be useful to keep the following in mind. For example, if you support an evolving theory that necessarily requires Christian's death to have been meticulously planned over an extended period of time, you have to look at what other parts of the narrative, critical to that argument, may entirely fall apart or contradict that position when you apply that logic. Once you start doing that, you realise that there are no longer infinite possibilities. You realise that maybe the investigators applied logic to multiple elements of evidence and arrived at a conclusion that was the only one they could possibly arrive at. Now, I'll finish up with this. A comment was recently made on the Justice for Christian page that seemed to gloat that the release of the case file in some way proved the cover-up and corruption surrounding Christian's death. That claim was supported by a suggestion that the case file, distributed to people under a FOIA request, was not complete. Now, aside from being an entirely flawed conclusion to arrive at, and FOIA requests are not the same as discovery, it fails on a couple of key points. First, no indication was given as to what specific types of material was missing by those making the claim. No proof or evidence of any type offered up to support the claim. It would seem logical, at least to me, that if you were truly wanting justice for Christian, the most efficient way to do that would be to release material that is claimed to be so conclusive of his murder. The process of only suggesting that this material exists without actually describing or releasing it is a very effective way to keep supporters on side and passionate and further underpin, albeit dubiously and deceitfully, claims of corruption and a cover-up. Now, secondly, and most importantly, if you haven't read the Knox & Associates report, I encourage you to. You will see it presents the argument that Christian was murdered, and it uses various ways to support that conclusion, all specifically focused on the crime scene forensics. Now, I'm not going to go in depth with respect to that report now, but a detailed analysis of it will definitely be an important part of our coverage of this matter. I mention that report because it's important in the context of the statement made suggesting a cover-up and corruption for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if someone didn't want to distribute any material which was suggestive of murder, that person would have left out the Knox & Associates report from the material that was shared. Rather than mess around with making lots of minor changes to the file to give less weight to the murder scenario, as has been suggested, simply leaving the Knox & Associates report out, or all the privately commissioned reports for that matter, out of the file distributed, would be a simple, fast, and entirely complete solution. And second, it makes no sense to say that the case file that has been distributed deliberately left out material that is conclusive of murder when the Knox & Associates report itself doesn't raise anything particularly conclusive. Meaning, Knox & Associates would have had access to all of the material, all of the forensic material at least, and they make no mention of anything that I would say is particularly conclusive. Some of the points they make are made well, but they would be heavily, and I suggest successfully, challenged if they were ever formally presented. And once again, ask yourself this: why, if material exists that is so conclusive of murder, and so demonstrative of a cover-up, would those interested in achieving justice for Christian want those documents hidden? Surely you would take steps to distribute that as widely as possible. When some shout loudly about claims of a jailhouse snitch, but then refuse to share other material, you have to question what the true motive is behind their actions. Is it really about getting to the truth, or is it an inability to accept the truth? As I said earlier, we'll be finishing our general coverage of the Melbourne case on the 19th of January, and then, the following Sunday, 26th of January, our coverage of the matter of the death of Mr. Christian Andriacchio will start. If you haven't already joined our Facebook page, I strongly encourage you to do so. If you do, don't forget to answer the membership questions and read the group rules. And above all, be respectful. We do this, meaning myself and the admins and the moderators, not to profit, but out of a passion for the truth. A bizarre claims that we are somehow exploiting Christian's death, whilst at the same time, in the same message, the author of that claim promotes the Culpable podcast, a podcast that appears to generate ad revenue and presumably doesn't have all the participants donating their time for free, has no doubt set the stage for an interesting period of time ahead. We look forward to you joining us as we set the record straight.
Thank you.